Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 278. And this week I have dogs playing in the background, so apologies if you can hear it's playtime and Lila's kicking off. There you go. This week it is Terri's turn to share something. Luckily, not much of me talking. What have you got for us, Terri?
Well, Daisy, a little bit of a weird diversion for me. Something that you and I are familiar with and probably both interested in, but I don't think I really knew the history of it, so I thought this might be interesting. So I found somehow this podcast called Everything Everywhere Daily. The host of it is a man named Gary Arndt, and he had a travel business, and in 2020 pretty much shut down due to COVID. And so he had to kind of make a transition and do something else. So he started a podcast. He already had a website called Everything Everywhere because he's been everywhere and he has learned so much about geography and history and science and politics and things just all around the world. So a little less fascinating than something he might have covered in other episodes, but this one is about seed oils.
Uh-huh.
So why talk about seed oils? One of the things that I found fascinating about this, and I will share my perspective and you might have a different take on this, but having come through kind of getting to know each other through the keto world and looking at things like that, there was a big emphasis for some period of time on not consuming seed oils or kind of dangers of consuming seed oils. And lately, that has taken a little bit of a different turn. People have been paying a little less attention to seed oils in certain arenas. The Whole30 has now said we're okay with seed oils. We can't find conclusive evidence. Yeah, we can't find conclusive evidence that these are a problem. So, feel free. But I thought, well, how fascinating. So I know that many of our listeners also are people involved in TFM and low carb communities and may be interested in this topic. So I'm bringing up kind of the background, not the controversy. But also we have listeners who may not be familiar with this at all, and this might be important for them as well. So currently, seed oils are everywhere in the modern diet. Almost all processed food, snack foods, convenience foods are filled with seed oils. Now, I say everywhere, but especially in the US. This isn't always true in other places, but in the US, they're very prominent. It's one of the biggest components of the modern diet, and interestingly, was completely absent from the human diet just a little over a century ago. And sometimes people say, well, our bodies are really adept at changing. Well, our bodies, our biology does not change so quickly that we can adapt to something that didn't even exist in our food to now being one of the most prominent features in our food in just a century. So just, kind of some thoughts about, might this be a problem? He then went through clarifying some information because he wants to make sure people know what he's talking about with seed oils. And he's talking about, we might often refer to them as vegetable oils. And unfortunately, there's actually no vegetables in them. So that's kind of a misnomer. But they are made out of seeds and grain. So referring to them as seed oils. And the most common seed oils are cottonseed, soybean, corn, sunflower, safflower, and canola. Now, I remember, I don't even know when, 30 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, when everyone started getting really keen on let's clean up the oils that we're using. Let's use healthier oils. And so they really were pushing sunflower, safflower, and canola, but they're in the same category, so just as problematic. Another way to think of them is to think of them as industrial seed oils, because that's really more what this is about. It's how they're produced. If you look at something like olive oil The olive oils are produced with cold press. So basically, you just need a couple of heavy things that you press together, and you're going to get the oil out of an olive. So it's a very clean process. It doesn't involve chemicals and other things to press these things. Coconut oil, same thing. You just need to take the flesh of the coconut and press it between some heavy things, and you get coconut oil. But industrial seed oils, it's not that easy. You can't just squeeze corn and get oil out of it. So they had to come up with a process. Now, cold pressed oils, again, like olive oil, coconut oil, have been around for thousands of years. And again, they're really in their natural form already. They're just extracted from the host, but they are very natural. But when you think then of these industrial seed oils, there's really nothing natural about them. So again, before industrialization, seed oils really weren't a part of our diet. We didn't consume them. Traditional societies use things like lard and tallow and butter. And some places were using olive oil, coconut oil, and sesame oil. But the seeds of plants like flax, hemp, we get linseed oil, we get castor oil. These were sometimes used for oil for lamps, paints, and medicinal purposes rather than food. So they were not consumed. And then mechanical presses became available in the 19th century, which allowed for some extraction of oil from these seeds. And then it wasn't until the mid-1800s that they developed some hydraulic presses, which allowed for much greater production of these types of oils because they could apply more pressure to the seeds and get more oil. In the late 1800s in the US, cottonseed was a waste product of the cotton industry. So it was, massive amounts of waste coming out of something that was highly utilized. And so as they invented these presses that could do more, they started realizing, we could make some money off of using the byproduct of these cotton seeds, and that it could be refined and marketed as an oil. Prior to that, they had used it sparingly in livestock feed and as fertilizer. But as they kept increasing their technology with making these presses and different extraction methods, they then could start to use more and more of this oil. And at first it was used more in the production of soap, candles, and lubricants. So again, not yet really for human consumption. And partly they didn't use it for human consumption. The example of cottonseed is because it had a very bitter taste and often was filled with impurities. Welcome to the 20th century, and two chemical breakthroughs happened that allowed them to process this oil further, refine it further, get rid of the bitter taste, get rid of the impurities. But you can imagine what they're doing is they're running it through a chemical process. And at some point in this, he talks about the many steps. They had to hydrogenate it. They had to clean it. They had to bleach it. They had to do all of these things to make it usable. They also had to make it something that could be shelf stable, that could turn it into a solid fat that would last. So in 1912, two chemists won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for their work in creating these seed oils. Eventually, they came to a point where they could use cottonseed oil as a food product. And in the US, this was created and was called Crisco.
Oh, yes. Heard
it
of
was
it. Yeah.
introduced in 1911, and it had a similar texture and color to lard. So it was sold as a lard replacement. So obviously they had to really market it. They had to give away cookbooks and recipes to teach people you can make everything with Crisco. So sales of Crisco skyrocket over the next few decades. These companies also then received funding from a very small organization with a $1.5 million donation. And this organization happened to be called the American Heart Association. So You can hear already it was being touted as being healthy, this alternative to these animal fats. And it was plant-based, and what a healthy way to produce a lot of food, produce shelf-stable food, and to make money for the producers of all of this. So World War I and World War II accelerate the development of these seed oils, both for industrial uses and as cheap food substitutes. At this point, soybean oil in the US became very popular because it was widely grown and it was able to replace these more expensive animal fats and things that had been used previously. So in the mid-20th century, we saw in the US an explosion in production of corn oil, soybean oil, and other oil seed crops. And they were subsidized, so they're grown in vast monocultures, and they're heavily processed into oils. By the 1950s, soybean oil had overtaken butter in the American diet, and it was promoted again as being healthier, plant-based alternative to those nasty saturated fats. This is around the time that we were starting to get concerned about the lipid hypothesis of that this is what is causing heart attacks. And soybeans also were beneficial because kind of a double yield. They produced animal feed with the protein and then oil for the human consumption. So a crop of soybeans could do both. Corn oil then followed a similar path. And again, it was marketed as heart healthy oil up until the mid 20th century. So likewise, then canola and sunflower and safflower oils became more and more prevalent. But, he pointed something out. You never go to a farmer's market and see any kind of artisanal or handmade seed oils because they can't. You see lard and you see these other natural things, butter and ghee, but you will not see handmade seed oils. And that should kind of tell us something. So again, he hops through what has to happen. So after the seeds are cleaned, dehulled, and crushed into flakes, oil is extracted through mechanical processing or through chemical solvent extraction using hexane. So this is how our oils are being made. And then it has to undergo refinement steps, degumming, using acids and water, neutralizing, eliminating the free fatty acids, bleaching. So again, all of this that has to happen to make this something that we can actually consume. And then in the second half of the 20th century, at least here in the US, the processed food industry just exploded. And so using these oils for that really became kind of the cornerstone of mass producing this neutral flavor, stable and low cost oil. And this is why it's used in processed foods. It's inexpensive, it lasts, and again, makes them super unhealthy for us. Used in baked goods, salad dressings, margarine, snack foods, and in our fast food fryers. So I thought it was interesting. At this point, he shares some statistics. And as the industry kept growing, currently, the global average seed oil consumption is around 27 kilograms per person per year, or roughly 60 pounds. This equates to about 74 grams per day, or more than 6 tablespoons of oil daily. Americans consume closer to 35 to 40 kilograms, or 77 to 88 pounds per year, with most of that coming from soybean and canola. So again, back in the early 1900s, Americans consumed almost zero industrial seed oils, but now it makes up over 20% of the daily caloric intake, primarily in processed food and restaurant cooking. So the substitution of seed oil for traditional fats, which were primarily animal fats and some cold-pressed fats, is really seen as the most significant dietary change in human history. And again, over a very short period of time. And so Gary Arndt, the host of this, talked about how he sees the seed oil now everywhere as he travels. And in terms of finances, the global seed oil market It's estimated to be $260 billion in 2024, projected to grow compounding annually at a rate of approximately 4%. So it should be about $387 billion in just 9 years in 2034. Soybeans dominate the market currently, accounting for 59% of the total revenue in 2024. So what are the implications of this? I think one of the things that I look at as most important to this is the science that points to the increase in inflammation that is caused with these fats. And the reason this is that omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, or as some of us like to refer to as PUFAs, they occur in these oils. They're high in omega-6 PUFAs. And omega-6 occurs naturally, and it's been consumed by humans since the beginning of time. However, it's also been consumed alongside of omega-3 fatty acids. And traditional diets had an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio estimated at 1:1 up to 4:1, depending on where people lived and local foods. But modern diets now often have ratios of 15:1 up to 20:1. And research suggests that this imbalance may help promote inflammation. And that's one of the reasons that I encourage folks to be really mindful about eating out, the type of fats that are used there in their salad dressings and in their preparation of foods, and also what they eat at home. And so the reason I wanted to share this today, as I said, is because I think for some of us, it's just reaffirming of some decisions we're already making. And for others of us, it might be something that prompts us to look at our food, the amount of processed food we eat, the types of food we eat, what we cook with, how often we eat out, because it's been so much a part of our lives that we're not even aware of the potential harm that is done using something in the way it's created, and how quickly we have adapted this as such a normal part of our eating, and our bodies are not fully adapted to being able to use it in a healthy way.
Yes, it's very interesting. And I've been Googling to try and find out the difference in the UK. And according to Google, anyway, the most common cooking oil here is, we call it rapeseed oil. That's the same as canola. And sunflower oil is the most common. There was, we had the same backlash with the PUFAs, and sunflower oil came out as quite a, the dominant alternative. So, things like crisps or chips, as you say, often highlighted on the packet that they're cooked in sunflower oil. There was a big push here to promote rapeseed oil as being quite heart healthy. And this is where there's nuance in it. And I remember looking into this before and trying to find really sort of robust answers to it and struggling to do so. How much of a difference there is when it comes to some of these oils that are thought of as being not great to have. Is there a difference if they are cold pressed? Because you say you don't see, and you probably don't in America, you wouldn't see these oils on sort of farmers market type stalls. Well, actually, you probably would here. You would see some cold press rapeseed and some cold pressed oils in France, for example. I used to live in a walnut area, and there were a lot of local places that sold walnut oil, which was absolutely delicious. A delicious plain green leaves salad with walnut oil and some goat's cheese. Absolutely delicious. But I mean, my assumption would be that there is a big difference between any of these oils, even if they're seed oils, if they're cold pressed, as opposed to going through an industrial process. And I think that applies for things like olive oil as well, doesn't it? When we, when we talk about olive oil as being healthy, is it any old olive oil, or do you really have to stick to the extra virgin olive oil? In the UK, we've held on to our saturated fats a bit more. You've always been able to get lard in the supermarkets. It's usually been quite a dominant thing. Like when I used to make a fair amount of pastry, used to make mince pies at Christmas a lot, you get a much lighter, shorter pastry or a tasty pastry if you mix lard and butter. You can go all butter, but you tend to get softer. If you want it to be crisper and shorter, you put some of that lard in. So, we have held on to those more than you have, and we don't have quite as many of the vegetable oils that you have. Like I say, here it's sort of really rapeseed and sunflower. I think maybe also groundnut, peanut oil. We have a fair amount, obviously, as well as the thought of as healthier ones like coconut oil and the ones that you've mentioned. But yes, I do wonder how much it depends if they're cold pressed, and then also whether you heat them or not. So for example, I have bought some cold pressed rapeseed oil, don't particularly like the flavour of it, but would a cold pressed oil used cold in a salad dressing be considered okay? So there are two issues there, the process of production, but then also whether you heat it. And you've got the whole thing, haven't you, with smoking points and heating various oils. Like I think sesame oil has quite a high smoke point, so you can heat it to a higher temperature than something like olive oil. Whether it solidifies when it cools down, that it doesn't oxidize in the same way. And then, how many times you reheat that oil. So I think there are quite a lot of factors to play here, potentially, that it's not necessarily a black and white answer. I don't know if he got into that at all, whether we can actually use some of these things in certain circumstances, or is all rapeseed oil not a good idea? As an example, let's just vilify rapeseed oil here, but
well, I would say from this podcast, he really didn't go into whether we should be using them or not. That's my take on this. The other challenge with the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, these industrialized seed oils, is due to the chemical nature, the risk of them becoming rancid. And so I think that's another factor to really consider. How are they processed? How are they stored? You talk about, and even olive oil and avocado oil, that it should be in darker bottles, darker glass, not clear glass, because the oxidation process creates more problem with the oils. And so it makes me wonder a little bit with some of these industrial processed oils, how long are they technically good for? When do they become rancid? And if we're eating rancid oil, I don't know if we always can taste that or not, but are we adding some risk then? So he didn't really go into anything about hand processed of these, I think partially because on a grand scale, that's not how they're produced. They're produced with, these industrialized chemical processes. Even though I do really try to stay away from the industrialized seed oils, I probably would be more open to eating them if they were hand processed like that. Similarly, when I was in Barcelona, I ate certain things that I wouldn't eat in the US just based on the ingredients and the quality of the processing of foods. I would be more open to it if I knew they were more small scale, how they were created versus the over processing. And even coconut oil. I've been using coconut oil for probably about 10 or 11 years now. And I don't buy the processed, the refined, where they take the scent and taste of coconut out.
Yes, I figured that was going to be problematic. Yeah, if it doesn't taste like coconut anymore, that to me, that says it's been through quite an industrial cleaning process.
Yeah, that's right. So for me and my own choices, I try to stay away from more refining, more chemical processing as I can.
Yes, I would say the same. And I've been much more aware of, when I'm walking past fish and chip shops and other places that are frying and really being aware of sort of smelling the overuse of the oil and thinking, actually, I don't really fancy things that have been cooked in that. But I've thought for a while, from a logical point of view, things like I mentioned, like that, the walnut oil that's pressed in a local place that's producing nuts in rural France is going to be fine. And especially if you're having it cold on a salad. But yeah, it was when you mentioned the Whole30, I wonder how much nuance they put, how many rules they put on the use of seed oil. So I'll be having a Google at that afterwards. But yes, my brain and my logic says that the more naturally it's produced, the better. I've had to for example, pumpkin seed oil, and that tastes delicious, very strong, but just a little bit mixed in with a lighter oil in a salad is delicious. And that's the kind of place I use those kind of oils. Hazelnut oil tastes delicious, and like I say, walnut, really, really good. But yeah, my cooking go-to is usually things like lard and butter and the saturated fats.
You highlighted too the fat fryers, the deep fryers used in so many restaurants. Unfortunately, the quality of the oil and the overuse of the oil, high temperature, the problems with that, and then using it over and over. And, I love me some fried food, but I really have to be mindful about how often I expose myself to that, just because of what I believe are just some natural problems with the process.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And as you said, to start with, we're not here to bang a drum and say you can or can't do something. But the more knowledge you have, the more choices you can make. Like I say, I often just don't fancy it because I'm just more aware of the process ease and what's going on. And then you're sort of walking past, you're thinking, yeah, actually I can smell that and I don't really fancy it. But yeah, of course, sometimes I have things, you can't really, it's very, very difficult. Not you can't, it's very difficult to eat out without consuming some. It's going to be in there somewhere. A lot of that just comes down to quantity and frequency, doesn't it? It's not something I do very often. Most of the food I eat, I've prepared for myself at home. So it's easy, but yeah, I will use some of these oils in a salad dressing to make it taste different, more interesting.
Yeah, and I like your point too. It's really the dose that makes the poison. And so, will I eat some of these things kind of incidentally when I'm at a restaurant or something? Yeah, of course I know I am. How often? How much? Maybe I choose something that's a little less deep fried, something to just avoid some of it. And I don't experience this directly, but I know people who do, that they can really tell after they've eaten out. They don't feel as well. Their joint pain is up, or their, just gut issues are kind of off kilter. And so, I don't think, I'm not someone who has the amazing results of, I listened to a podcast one time about a gentleman who stopped using all seed oils, and suddenly his gut issues all repaired and he never needed sunscreen again. I don't know that I've had those miraculous results, but I know that overall, I think I'm doing something better for my health, and I feel better when I'm not consuming as much of the seed oils.
Yeah, definitely. Well, very interesting. And I'm going to go and round up my dogs and feed them, because Terri can see in the background, it's Rocket and Lila who are playing, and they do get quite vocal. They've stopped with the squeaky toy, which is one thing. Although I say that, he'll probably pick it up and start again now.
Little WrestleMania never heard any podcast episode.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much. And until I see you next time, I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.